So research really has to underpin our efforts to promote early intervention, as we just heard about. We now can take for granted the concept that early implantation is critical for language development because of the fundamental research on central auditory maturation and plasticity conducted by our keynote speaker this morning and other investigators. It's a pleasure to introduce an esteemed colleague from Hanover, Germany, Professor Dr. Andrej Kral. Professor Kral is chair of auditory neuroscience at the clinics of otolaryngology and leads the Department of Experimental Otology at Hanover Medical School. He also holds an appointment of Professor of Systems Neuroscience at Macquarie University in Sydney, Australia. Dr. Kral specializes in experimental auditory neurophysiology in animal models and in humans. His very productive research career has focused on central effects of hearing loss and deafness, brain development and plasticity, neuroscience of cochlear implants, and technology of neuroprosthetics. He has 9 pages of PubMed citations in high-impact journals and is one of the world's authorities on auditory development and adaptation. Dr. Kral, we're very much looking forward to your presentation on the maturation of auditory system related to early auditory experience this morning. Welcome.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your kind words, and it's an honor to be here and to speak to you. One feels a little bit like Taylor Swift here, because probably get sunburned after half an hour. But anyhow, yeah, I was asked to talk about maturation of the auditory system, and first I would like to make the disclosure that part of this was supported by MED-EL, but it's basic research. I think I'm not too much biased by the industry, and our animal model that we extensively have used in the past is the congenitally deaf cat. These animals have no hearing experience due to an inborn dysplasia of the organ of Corti, but they have an excellent preservation of spiral ganglion cells, and that allows us to use, here we go, to use a cochlear implant either acutely to stimulate the auditory nerve and by that gain information about the functionality of the auditory system, or to provide the animals with a chronic hearing experience over time so that we can study the maturation of and plasticity in the brain due to cochlear implant stimulation. Now, this makes the animal model a higher mammal model of human prelingual deafness. And what I've been always interested in is the observation of the critical period for therapy of deafness. And you all know this is established fact since many, many years ago. Maybe the most comprehensive study on this topic was done by Manuel Manrique in University of Navarra in Spain. Here you can see the outcomes of the study. It's 98 children. He tested them with a bisyllabic words test in Spanish as a function. It's shown as a function of duration of use in years. And as you can see, those kids that were implanted in the first 3 years of life reached, after 4 years of experience, nearly ceiling performance. However, those who were implanted later, 3 years later, their performance was lower and more variable. And if they were implanted after 7 years of age, the performance hardly lifted from the ground. But these kids, they could hear with the implant. What they couldn't do is they couldn't discriminate complex sounds, and they couldn't identify them. So it's kind of a higher processing, auditory processing. And we studied that on cats. The cats received a cochlear implant and had a speech processor in a jacket, could freely move, and were chronically stimulated. And we also observed a critical period quite corresponding to the data results in the auditory cortex of these cats. And these and other results also from Curtis Ponton, Jos Egermont, Anu Sharma, Karen Gordon, and others point to the fact that the auditory cortex is the bottleneck of the critical period. And maybe we can discuss that later on. But it seems that it's the auditory phonetic analysis that feeds the language network that closes the critical period for speech understanding. Now, what happens, what is the reason for this? If we look at the neurons in the primary auditory cortex of children who died at different ages and were analyzed by Professor Larry Connell, you can see that the dendritic trees undergo a massive development after birth, after the child is really confronted with the environment. And dendritic trees carry synapses, and when colleagues here in the US counted synapses in the brain of these children or other children who also died in young age, they observed that there is a massive synaptogenesis within the first year, then a synaptic overshoot, followed by synaptic elimination or pruning. That is a slow process, but an extensive process that continues into teen ages and eliminates nearly half of the synapses. And the theory says that this is because the brain generates so many synapses very early on that it cannot maintain them on a long-term basis. That is good because it makes the brain adaptable. But once the brain is confronted with a given environment, it must specialize. And during this specialization, it loses those synapses that are not needed for processing the demands of the environment. Now, if this theory is true, then we can ask the question, what happens in deafness? How much is this process influenced by complete hearing loss? If activity drives synaptic elimination, then which synapses remain? These data are not existing for humans, but we could study them in animals, and we studied more than synaptic counts. We looked at synaptic activity, which is a measure of synaptic count and their function. What you can see here is synaptic activity as a function of age of the animals, and these were hearing cats. Each bullet is one cat. This last bullet is a ground mean of 5 animals. And what you can see is that also in cats, there is a synaptogenesis early around birth, then synaptic overshoot, and then synaptic elimination. So very similar in shape to the human course. And since we had the deaf cats, we could also study the deaf cats and compare them to hearing cats. And what you can see then is that the synaptogenesis is delayed and the synaptic elimination is more pronounced. And this point is again a grand mean. The interesting observation, when you compare now statistically these groups, you can see the significant differences. Also in the adults, you can see much less synapses remain in the deaf brain. It means the computational power is reduced. And the interesting observation was also that this reduction in computational power that we observed in deaf animals corresponded to the critical period that we observed in the chronically stimulated animals. So it means that the loss of synapses is that process that probably closes the critical period. Potentially, the point of no return is this point where the two curves cross. And it's very difficult to translate across different species developmental stages, but it's possible. And when we did that, this is 4.2 months. When we did that, we obtained for humans 36 months, 3 years. That corresponds to the human critical period. So it looks like if this process would be responsible for the end of the critical period in deaf children. However, it's not only this that is different in the time courses. It starts very early on. It starts from birth in the cat, nearly from birth in a cat. So the whole process is altered, and that explains why the earlier the implantation, the better the outcomes, even within the critical period. But which synapses are eliminated here? What do they normally do in the cortex? Well, to answer that question, I have prepared an example, and I'm not sure if you can see it so well in the back. I'm sorry for that. It's a photograph of a Tiffany window that I took in Orlando, Florida many years ago. And yeah, it's beautiful. You can imagine how it would look like if you had it at home and the sun would shine through that and you would have these golden brown colors in your room. But maybe I can slightly influence your perception of this window by asking Do you see an animal there somewhere? Anybody? Maybe I help you a little bit. There is a butterfly. One butterfly. There's another here, another here, another here, another here, another here. All over the place there are butterflies. You didn't see them before, and now maybe the window got life. Now you maybe are reminded to the forest in Mexico where the monarch butterflies come and meet from North America and occupy the trees, and everything is moving and the colors of the butterflies are all over the place. But the stimulus has not changed. The visual stimulus was the same. What changed was kind of state of mind of yours. And this suggests that perception can be a process of combining sensory features into sensory objects, combining objects into scenes. That's a bottom-up pathway of processing. But there is a possibility that if you point to objects, then you decide to attend to other features, and then the whole situation changes. So there is also a top-down stream of information. And the predictive processing theory, an old theory developed for explaining some learning results, suggests that the brain actually always develops an inner mental model of the environment. If I close my eyes, I know you are sitting there, there are these blinding lights, there are these screens, there is my mouse. I don't need to see it. I don't need to all the time instantaneously compute it from the sensory input. So the inner model generates predictions. And whenever these predictions are met with the sensory input, the brain doesn't need to compute anything. Everything is fine. So it relieves the brain from a lot of computational effort. It's only the case when there is a discrepancy, when there is a prediction error, then the brain has to update the inner mental model and maybe has to learn. So this is a very influential theory, as I said, very old one. And from the developmental perspective, it is also interesting because the baby, when it's born, it doesn't have inner mental model developed yet. There are no objects, there are only features. So it starts with the bottom-up stream of processing. And indeed, when you look into the cortex, we know that features are represented in primary cortical areas, objects in secondary, and everything else in associative higher order areas. And if you look at connectivity between these areas, you find out that first the connections are formed, the bottom-up or feed-forward connections are formed, and only much later in postnatal development, the top-down or the feedback projections are established. Now you can ask the question, so what does it mean for this? If an animal or a child is deaf, is there a disproportional effect on this bottom-up and top-down stream? Well, and we studied that in the cat. We could insert multi-electrode arrays in primary and in secondary auditory areas and look at these interaction functionally. And in a series of studies, we observed that indeed it's primarily the top-down projections that are compromised by deafness. And that means that this reduction of the computational effort is reduced. And it makes a lot of sense. I mean, a deaf animal doesn't have auditory objects, so why should it influence any input by any kind of object? Doesn't make much sense. It's not meaningful. The question now, of course, here is, and your question would be, okay, so this is cat. Who cares? What about humans? So when is this process formed in an infant? Well, you know that children are born already with a preference for mother language and mother's voice due to intrauterine hearing experience, and they start very soon to experiment with vowels, imitate the caregiver. Later on, around the age of 6 months, they start to train co-articulation, so combine consonants with vowels, called canonical babbling. What happens in between is interesting, and there is only data, really solid data from the visual system. It seems that around the age of 4 months, the babies start to categorize sensory features into sensory objects. So they start to recognize the butterfly, so to say, as a butterfly and not as a patch of colors. And around the age of 6 months, top-down interactions are observed in infants. That it's the case for the auditory system is demonstrated by the fact that around 7 to 8 months there is a loss of discrimination of foreign phonemes. You remember the Berker and Thies studies. And that is a collateral effect of categorization. Imagine you have a phoneme, during the categorization, you not only form a categorical border, you also fuse whatever falls into this area into one percept. I can say 100 times ba, it's always acoustically a different ba, but you hear always ba. Now, if the foreign categorical border falls within one native category, we stop discriminating those sounds. And that's exactly what happens, and that suggests that really this happens also in the auditory system. Now, later on, as you know, there is first understanding of words, then a massive buildup of vocabulary in the second year of life, and then further syntactic and semantic development. And this means that deafness, as I already said, affects very early development, already here, actually even here, because the preference of mother language and mother's voice is also a consequence of experience. So we need to consider that effects of deafness set in well before 6 months of age, in very, very young infants. The job that happens in the first month is a difficult one, to form representations. Now imagine you are an alien, somewhere from, I don't know, Melmac, and you place a camera into the eye of a human, and you start to try to understand what's going on outside. You have no idea about three-dimensional space, about the sun, about shadows, about perspective. Now, some scientists say that it's to resolve sensory representations from observation of the highly variable sensory input alone is an underdetermined task. There is not one solution. It's too variable. But fortunately, during development, there is perception is not only a passive thing. Perception leads to action, and action affects perception. This gentleman here can move the legs, can move the hand. He knows that he moved the hand. He knows that he moved the leg. And he can observe what happens visually and combine those two data. And that makes the whole thing a determined task. So motor system and active interaction with the environment disambiguate sensory input and make the task of establishing sensory representation a determined task. This means that we have to complement actually this scheme that I showed you before. We need to add action and frontal cortex. You make a plan, decide. Motor act, motor cortex. Environment, you change the environment. That affects the sensory input, and that the features that come in. And that's an important aspect of all this. I mean, that it's really the case you can see in some. It may be the first artistic acts that Homo sapiens were able to do. The picture of a hand, they put pigment into the mouth and they left that probably because they thought, this is me. What I see here as a moving hand is part of me. It shows that they were aware of themselves, and it's a signature. But it also shows how important, so to say, the fact was that they could observe their own movement and their own body parts. And for the brain, it's even better because there is information about actions called corollary discharge. The sensory system receives information that we plan to move. And when we move, there is proprioceptive feedback. The brain knows where the muscles and where the joints actually are. So we have much, much more information, and that makes the process of determining sensory representation a determined task. So sensory motor contingencies are very important. These are repeated consistencies between motor act and sensory input resulting from it. Now this means that hearing requires active interaction. There needs to be a partner, and there needs to be an exploration of the environment. And that's an important observation. I mean, communication, as you all know, starts as a very simple communication with gestures. Turn-taking is the simplest active conversation with changing roles, sender and receiver. And you can observe the dyadic communication between infant and caregiver already at 3 months. And the interesting thing is that this communication for the baby, it's not passive. The baby is active. You can demonstrate this with still face experiments, where the caregiver stops responding, and then the baby tries to attract the attention, and there are nice movies on YouTube, you can find them. So the infant shows active exploratory efforts already at that age. So the interaction is active from the child, from the infant side. And then later on, an object enters this. It's called triadic communication, and some psychologists call it a 9-month miracle, because around this age, the infant starts to use a common reference with the caregiver, trace the objects, point to objects, share goals, and this is an extremely important developmental step. But hearing loss reduces the amount of triadic communication. So you see already in the first year a massive influence on the development of the child. And it's not only sensory development. I mean, the senses, the motor system and the sensory system develop in the intrauterine life. And when the child is born, they have some functionality already. However, the motor system is immature. So the babies, they cannot explore the world. They see the caregiver. They are nearsighted. So they see only the closed space. That's their space. And it's maybe useful, because at that time they first have to explore that before they start to conquer the world and crawl and walk. And around this time, multisensory interactions are being trained. And bimodal, trimodal representations are being formed. And this all happens, the development happens, we always imagine it as a cascading sequence, even though it's a certain continuum with some steps, some jumps. And these probably happen in synchronous steps between the different sensory systems. And they feed cognition. We need multisensory abstract representation to feed cognition. Cognition starts early. The active part, as I mentioned, starts with 3 months. So what happens in deafness, you take one player out of the game, and suddenly the development, it continues, it doesn't wait, but it continues without hearing. And if it comes later, the question is, can it be incorporated into these developmental steps that have already been taken? The other sensory systems don't wait for the delayed hearing. Maybe one consequence, these are data from William Kronberger from Indiana University, that we reported in a review paper. You can see here deaf, cochlear implanted children and hearing children in comparison using a LEAF questionnaire, which is a questionnaire, as the word says. And it quantifies non-auditory functions that are shown here below, and I hope you can read it: processing speed, attention, working memory, factual memory, comprehension, and conceptual learning. What one can see is that the performance of the deaf children is significantly poorer in mean. Not in every child, and not this and this and this child is not the same child. This is called cognitive scatter. Different functions are affected in different ways. But this is a typical consequence of sensory deprivation, also observed in the visual system. That might have the underlying reason in the early development where hearing is not present and cognition cannot use hearing and hearing cannot form cognition. We have translated the questionnaire into German, and these are first data. From that, we have, I think, I don't see my notes, but I think we have 220 control kids and 130 hearing impaired children. And the results reproduce what Bill described previously. Here you can see comprehension and conceptual learning. The hearing impaired children, you can see that the distribution is different. The normal children, they are around 0 here formed, and the median is actually very close to 0 in the hearing impaired. It's not, and it's highly significant. And the total score, where we could incorporate all the children, you can again see the distribution is different. So So this is solid, and we have some information that deafness in rats can cause effects on cognitive functions too. So you don't need language to see this effect. It's hearing. It's partly, at least in part, hearing. Now, therefore, we suggest that we have to consider hearing loss as a disease for the whole brain. It's not only the ear that has a problem. The brain has a problem because the auditory cortex has reciprocal connections to many, many non-auditory functions, and these can use the auditory system as a board, so to say, to draw, to imagine. You know, when you think of something, you either imagine visually things or you talk to yourself. So you use the auditory cortex to process information even when there is no stimulus. Okay, the last 6 minutes. So having said all that, do we implant early enough? We were wondering about this, and we didn't know how to properly assess that. And so we decided, and it was Jerry O'Donoghue's idea, to ask the companies, when do they sell their implants? At which age do the patients receive the first implant? That's the only information that we have. But we can take the first 3 years and say, the first 3 years, these are prelingually and perilingually deaf children. So let's take the proportion of children within the first and the second and the third year from the 3 years period and see how many children relatively are implanted in the first year, in the second year, and in the third year. And I have data from all the 3 companies. Unfortunately, for Advanced Bionics, there is a little thing, therefore I couldn't incorporate them yet into the data, but I have to say the MED-EL and the Cochlear data are nearly identical. The medians didn't move when we added the other companies. So I think it's quite well reproducible. So here you see the data. It's 11 countries, 6 years, put all together. And you can see in the first year, the median is only 18% for the first year, 45% for the second year, and the rest is the third year. So it's not so great. Most of the children are implanted in the second year. And if they are implanted in the second year, they miss all what I was talking about, the 9th-month miracle, the multimodal interactions, all these things. Now, the question is, okay, this is the moment, so did it improve over the last 6 years? Well, sorry, I forgot about this. So, of course, there is evidence that implanting in the first year improves outcomes in language. So the first one is from our team, and the other ones are previous papers on that. So it's known that implantation within the first year is better than in the second year. So now come back to the question, does it improve over the years? Here are the data. So for the individual years, this is the first year implantation, and you can see the median didn't move much, not significant in one way or another. The second year didn't move much over the years. And this suggests that we are not trying, we are happy with the state of the art. But maybe it's not the best state of the art. Maybe we should try more. And we can try more. Here, individual countries, just few of them. But look here, some countries, Australia and Germany, sorry, that's my 2 affiliations. It has nothing to do with that. I didn't manipulate that. They are at around 40%. So somehow it's possible to get to 40%. US, 30%. Now, China and France, 20%. India, under 5%. And 40% is maybe also not optimal. Maybe we can push it even more. It's difficult, I know. Our clinicians in Hanover told me, that's really, really difficult, and I understand that, but my role is maybe to push you a little bit. So that was the idea. Okay, so let me conclude. Current medical treatment of pediatric hearing loss with cochlear implants is highly successful in providing speech comprehension, and a lot has been achieved in the 30 years since I am in this research. Brain development is affected by deafness already in the first months of life. Auditory processing is the bottleneck for the critical period or critical periods in therapy. Based on sensory experience, the fundamentals of multisensory interaction and cognition are outlined in the first months of life. facilitated by sensory motor contingencies and immature motor system of infants. 9 months is a key milestone of human sensory and cognitive development. This milestone is still missed in the majority of severely impaired, hearing-impaired children. Yeah, my thank goes to cats. This is my cat, and thank you very much. I'm not 1 or 2 questions. Okay, so we have time for 1 or 2 questions, but I have difficulties. Taylor Swift cannot see in the audience.
I have a question.
Okay. In the back. Okay. Yep.
Thank you so much for presenting this information and talking about the role of communication. I am wondering if there is any research that shows children who are waiting for their cochlear implants for whatever reason are using hearing aids to use the residual hearing while being in early intervention, where parents are being coached to be sensitive and responsive to that early communication, if we would see different outcomes even though they don't have full access to the auditory spectrum.
I think that's the case. I mean, any communication before implantation is helpful for development, and whatever you do, I mean, there are data also from England, from Tate and colleagues, from very old ones, and from Sue Archbold. That's what comes to my mind, that show that the communication before implantation is helpful and supportive.
Thank you.
But that cannot be used for delaying implantation. It's important that the implantation is performed early.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I 100% agree with that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Andrej, it's Shaq Saeed from London.
Hi.
I don't know whether you can see me.
Yeah, I can see just the surround, just the scheme of a person.
Well, don't worry, we can all see you. We all heard you. Once again, a hugely informative talk, as always. Really enjoyable.
Thank you.
So we've established through your work and the work of others that the auditory processing is the bottleneck. But in reality, delivering what you have described, the bottleneck is healthcare systems allowing us to do what the science is telling us. And it's not a question, it's more of a comment that all of us involved in cochlear implantation and auditory implants and managing children and infants with hearing loss, we have a moral and ethical duty to try and widen that bottleneck through our day-to-day practices, interactions with the reimbursement authorities, governments and our local, regional and national healthcare systems, because the evidence is so compelling. We're doing these infants and children a disservice by being shackled by these bottlenecks that we have.
Yeah, thank you very much. I couldn't express it better. Yeah, thank you.